Xavier's hand hovered over Varea's shoulder, his pulse hammering against his palm. He had expected a weeping girl, a shadow of a woman he'd have to pity. Instead, as the priest finished the vows, she turned to him with eyes like cold glass and whispered, "The trackers in your car were moved to the decoy 5 minutes ago. You're welcome, husband." The predator had finally met his match. The Drakov estate was a fortress of silence and marble, a place where Xavier Drakov ruled with an iron fist and a heart carved from ice. To him, Varea Solen was just a legacy debt, the cousin of a dead friend he was obligated to protect. He stood in the dim light of the private chapel, his jaw set, his presence radiating a dominance that usually brought men to their knees. He viewed this marriage as a nuisance, a tactical error he had to endure for a year. But as the ceremony concluded, the air in the room shifted. Varea, draped in delicate white lace that suggested a purity she didn't possess, didn't tremble. She didn't look at the floor. She stood with a terrifying, calm composure that made Xavier's skin prickle. In her steady gaze, he didn't see a victim. He saw a strategist who had been waiting for this exact moment to strike. The rain in Moscow didn't fall. It shattered against the pavement like the glass from the warehouse windows 3 years ago. Xavier Drakov sat in the back of the darkened Maybach, the scent of Varea's expensive, cold perfume still clinging to his leather upholstery. But his mind was pulled back to the heat of the fire and the copper tang of blood. Before he was the undisputed king of the Drakov Empire, Xavier had been a man caught in a pincer move. It was the night of the Petrov ambush, a night he should have died. He remembered the feeling of his lungs burning, the heavy vibration of submachine guns, and the sudden, jarring weight of Leo Solen pulling him behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. Leo had been his only true friend, a man of high spirits and low caution. That night, Leo hadn't just saved Xavier. He had taken a bullet meant for Xavier's throat. As Xavier had pressed his hands against Leo's darkening shirt, trying to keep the life from leaking out, Leo had gripped his wrist with a strength born of pure desperation. "Don't let them have her, Zav," Leo had wheezed, his eyes unfocused. "The family, they'll trade her like a piece of meat. They call her a curse, but she's the only thing I have left that's clean. Promise me. Buy her. Marry her. Keep her out of their hands." At the time, Xavier had barely known who she was. He knew of the Solen girl, the quiet cousin who was whispered about in the elite circles as being dim-witted or socially stunted. She was the relative the Solenes kept in the attic rooms of their estate, the unwanted extra mouth to feed, a woman who had reached 32 without a single suitor because her own father claimed she was unfit for polite society. To Xavier, she was a ransom he didn't want to pay. He was a man who dealt in steel and concrete, not in the reclamation of broken women. But a blood debt to a dying man was the only law Xavier Drakov truly respected. The flashback shifted to the Solen study 6 months after the funeral. The air had been thick with the smell of stale cigars and desperation. Varea's uncle, Mikhail, had sat across from Xavier, leaning forward with a greedy glint in his eyes. "She's a burden, Xavier," Mikhail had said, dismissively waving a hand toward the ceiling. "She doesn't speak. She barely eats. She's slow. If you want to settle Leo's debt by taking her off our ledgers, I'll sign the papers today. Frankly, you're doing us a favor. We were going to send her to the convent in the mountains next month. She's useless to us." Xavier remembered the cold disgust he felt for the man, but he also remembered the relief. If she was as insignificant as they claimed, he could fulfill his promise easily. He would marry her, give her a wing of the estate, provide her with a staff, and never have to think of her again. She would be a ghost in his house, a quiet tax paid for his life. He had expected a woman who would flinch when he raised his voice. He had prepared himself for a life with a shadow, someone he would have to pity, someone who would be a permanent weight on his conscience. He had even instructed his house manager to buy the softest fabrics and simplest books, assuming her mind was as fragile as her reputation. Now, as the Maybach glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city, Xavier looked at the woman sitting beside him. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring out the window, her profile as sharp and unforgiving as a diamond. The unwanted price had just told him he was being hunted. She had moved his trackers. She had spoken with a clinical, icy precision that suggested she had been 5 steps ahead of him since the moment they met at the altar. "How long?" Xavier finally asked, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the small space of the car. Varela didn't turn her head. Her hands remained folded perfectly in her lap, the white lace of her sleeves contrasting against the black leather. "I've been monitoring the Petrov frequency since Leo's funeral, Xavier. Did you really think your security was tight? You use a standard 256-bit encryption. It took me 3 minutes to bypass it when I was bored last Tuesday." Xavier's pulse hammered. This wasn't the slow girl from the attic. This wasn't the unwanted cousin Leo had died to protect. As the car turned a corner and the streetlights illuminated her face, he saw the truth in her steady, forward-facing gaze. Leo hadn't asked Xavier to protect her because she was weak. He had asked Xavier to marry her because she was a weapon, and she had finally decided to unsheath herself. The Maybach slowed as the iron gates of the Drakov estate groaned open, revealing a fortress of charcoal stone and weeping willow trees that seemed to stand guard against the rest of the world. To the public, this was the pinnacle of architectural achievement. To Varela, as she stepped out of the car, it was simply a larger, more expensive version of the attic room she had just vacated. A dollhouse of marble and shadow, designed to keep her contained while Xavier went about the business of ruling his dark kingdom. Xavier didn't offer his hand as she stepped onto the gravel. He stood a few paces ahead, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the moonlit manor. The shock from the car ride had settled into a simmering, restless tension. He was a man who regained control by imposing structure, and as they crossed the threshold into the grand foyer, the air grew heavy with the unspoken mandates of his world. "This is not the Solène household," Xavier said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He didn't look back at her as he began to walk, his stride authoritative and rhythmic. "My life is governed by variables you cannot understand. For this arrangement to work, there are boundaries. You will stay within the residential wing unless escorted. You will not interface with the staff beyond basic needs. And most importantly, you will stay off the internal network. My security is for my eyes only." Varela followed him, her movements fluid and deceptively submissive. Her white lace train hissed against the polished floor, a ghost-like sound in the vast, silent space. She noted the placement of every camera, the blind spots near the arched doorways, and the specific model of the biometric locks on the heavy mahogany doors. "I understand, Xavier," she murmured. Her voice was soft, carrying the practiced lilt of the unwanted girl who had spent a decade apologizing for her own existence. "You want me to be a ghost? I've had many years of practice in that role." Xavier stopped abruptly at the foot of the grand staircase and turned. His eyes searched hers, looking for the flash of defiance he'd sensed in the car, but all he found was a mask of serene compliance. It frustrated him. He was used to enemies who snarled or subordinates who bowed. He wasn't prepared for a woman who simply absorbed his commands like a sponge. "I'm not trying to be cruel, Varela," he added, his tone softening just enough to reveal the internal conflict he was fighting. "I am trying to keep you alive. My world is a meat grinder. If you stay in the lines I've drawn, you'll be safe. If you wander, I can't guarantee what happens when the sensors trip." "The lines are very clear," she replied, offering him a faint, enigmatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. He left her then, retreating to his study to deal with the fallout of the afternoon's security breach, convinced he had successfully caged the bird Leo had left on his doorstep. But the moment the heavy doors of the master suite closed behind her, the fragile bride vanished. Varela didn't collapse onto the plush velvet bed or weep into the silk pillows. Instead, she moved to the window, watching the patrol guards through the glass. She didn't need to wander to break his rules. She had been breaking them from the moment she crossed the gates. 2 hours later, Xavier sat in his darkened office, staring at his monitors. He had doubled the encryption. He had reset the firewalls. He felt secure in his dominance. He reached for a glass of scotch, but his hand froze when he noticed a small, folded piece of paper sitting perfectly centered on his desk, a place no staff member had entered since he'd arrived. He unfolded it. Inside, in elegant, precise calligraphy, was a list of the 3 guards who had been checking their personal phones during their shift, along with a suggestion to adjust the thermal sensor on the north perimeter by 2 degrees to account for the humidity. At the bottom, A single sentence was written. The tea in the kitchen is oversteeped. I've prepared a fresh pot in the library, which is technically outside the residential wing. I hope you don't mind the transgression. Xavier surged to his feet, a cocktail of fury and disbelief racing through his veins. He threw open his doors and marched toward the library, his boots thundering against the stone. He expected to find her smug or preening. Instead, he found her sitting in a high-backed leather chair, bathed in the amber glow of a reading lamp. She was buried in a dense book on Byzantine history, a steaming cup of Earl Grey on the table beside her. She didn't even look up as he stormed into the room. She looked exactly like the quiet, insignificant woman the Soloness had ignored for years, except for the fact that she had bypassed a multi-million-dollar security system just to make him a drink. Xavier stood over her, his shadow looming large. I told you to stay in your wing. Varela turned a page, her expression one of mild, innocent confusion. I felt restless, Xavier. And you looked like a man who was losing his battle with a headache. Is the tea not to your liking? He looked at the tea, then at the woman who was supposed to be his burden. The rules were the only thing he had to keep them apart, and she was dismantling them with the quiet efficiency of a master thief. He realized then that his estate wasn't a prison for her. It was a playground. And for the first time in his life, Xavier Drakov felt like a guest in his own home. The morning light in the Drakov estate was as surgical and unforgiving as the man who owned it. Xavier sat in his high-tech command center, a room shielded by 3 feet of lead-reinforced concrete and encrypted with military-grade protocols that cost more than the GDP of a small nation. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, the rhythmic clicking of keys the only sound in the sterile air. He was a man who lived by the philosophy that if you controlled the information, you controlled the outcome. But as he logged into the Drakov private server, the unbreakable heart of his shipping and logistics empire, his blood turned to ice. A small, pixelated icon of a white rose sat in the bottom right corner of his primary monitor. It wasn't a virus. His systems weren't crashing. In fact, they were running 40% faster than they had the night before. Xavier leaned back, his jaw tightening so hard his teeth ached. He didn't check for stolen funds or leaked manifests. He knew instinctively that wasn't what this was. He began to trace the breadcrumbs left in the code, expecting to find a digital fingerprint from a rival syndicate or a government ghost. Instead, he found a patch. A brilliant, elegant piece of coding that filled a 0-day vulnerability in his firewall, a backdoor that had been left open by his own lead developer. If he hadn't seen it, a child with a laptop could have dismantled his entire bank of offshore accounts by noon. Xavier stood up, so abruptly his chair skidded across the floor. He didn't need to ask who had done it. He knew the scent of that perfume. He knew the quiet, steady awareness that had been watching him from across the dinner table. He found Varela in the sunroom, the most exposed part of the house. She was bathed in a pool of light, her long hair falling over her shoulders as she sketched in a leather-bound notebook. She looked so remarkably ordinary, so much like the unwanted cousin the Soloness had discarded, that for a moment, Xavier doubted his own eyes. You were in my server, he said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, low register that usually preceded a storm. Varela didn't startle. She didn't even look up from her drawing. The leak was in the 3rd-layer encryption, Xavier. Your developer used a recycled script from a public forum. It was sloppy. I couldn't sleep knowing someone might use it to find the location of the safe houses in the North District. Xavier crossed the room in 3 long strides, looming over her. You hacked a secure Mafia server because you couldn't sleep? Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were that same terrifyingly calm glass gray. I hacked it because I live here now, and I prefer my husband alive. If the Petrovs had found that glitch, they wouldn't have just taken your money. They would have used the GPS coordinates to level this house while we were eating our soup. The audacity of her pragmatism hit him like a physical blow. Xavier reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, the same hesitant, shocked gesture he'd made at the altar. He was a man who understood threats and power, but he did not understand her. Why didn't you just tell me? He demanded. Why the games? Why the rose icon on my screen? Because if I told you, you wouldn't have believed me, Varela said, her voice soft and devoid of any ego. You would have patted my head, called me a clever girl, and sent me back to my books while your professionals ignored the problem. I needed you to see the glitch, Xavier. I needed you to realize that the dollhouse you built for me is made of glass, and I'm the only one holding the stones." Xavier's lips parted, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the woman before him, the elegant lace of her dress, the softness of her features, and realized that every wall he had built to protect himself was useless. She wasn't an intruder. She was a ghost who had already moved in and rearranged the furniture. He realized with a jolt of genuine fear that he wasn't just unprepared for what she did next. He was starting to realize he might never be ready for her at all. She hadn't hacked him for leverage or wealth. She had done it to fix a flaw he didn't even know he had. "Don't do it again," he managed to say, though the command lacked its usual bite. Varela went back to her sketching, the pencil scratching lightly against the paper. "Then make sure your security is worth my silence, Xavier. Because next time, I might not be in the mood to fix it." As Xavier walked away, he felt the strange, unsettling sensation of the ground shifting beneath his feet. He had married her to fulfill a promise to a dead man, thinking he was the one holding all the cards. But as he looked back at the woman in the sunroom, he saw her turn a page with a quiet, lethal confidence. She wasn't his ward. She wasn't his burden. She was a glitch in his perfectly ordered life. And for the first time in his career, Xavier Drakov had no idea how to patch the hole she was making in his heart. The dining room of the Drakov estate was a cavern of dark oak and oppressive tradition, illuminated by a chandelier that cast jagged, bone-white shadows across the faces of the men gathered at the table. Xavier sat at the head, his presence a silent anchor in a room vibrating with the restless energy of his inner circle. To his right sat Varela, draped in a gown of midnight silk that made her skin appear like polished marble. She was the only woman in a room full of predators, and to Xavier's lieutenants, she looked like nothing more than a soft target. Ivan, a man whose ambition was as loud as his laugh, swirled a glass of vintage red wine, his eyes tracking Varela with a predatory condescension. He had spent the last hour treating her as if she were part of the centerpiece, beautiful, inanimate, and entirely irrelevant to the business of blood. "It's a generous thing you've done, Xavier," Ivan said, his voice cutting through the clatter of silverware. "Taking in the Solène girl. It's noble to honor a dead man's debt, even if the interest is a bit heavy. I imagine she finds the transition from an attic to a palace quite overwhelming. Does she speak, or is she merely here for the aesthetic?" A low ripple of laughter traveled down the table. The men shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Xavier's stony expression and Varela's downward gaze. Xavier felt a familiar, hot prickle of rage at the back of his neck, his fingers tightening around his steak knife. He was a heartbeat away from reminding Ivan why the Drakov name was feared, but before he could speak, the air in the room didn't just chill, it froze. Varela set her fork down with a quiet, deliberate click. She didn't look offended. She looked bored. "I speak quite well, Ivan," she said, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the gravelly tones of the men. She finally looked up, her steady gaze locking onto Ivan's. "I was just wondering if your tongue would be quite so loose if you knew I'd spent the afternoon reviewing the logistics manifest for the warehouse in the South District. The one where 40% of the high-end electronics seemed to vanish before they reached the inventory sheets." The laughter died instantly. Ivan's face drained of color, his hand pausing midair. "I don't know what you're." "And then there's Marcus," Varela continued, her eyes drifting toward the man sitting opposite Ivan, a lieutenant known for his ironclad loyalty. Marcus stiffened as she offered him a small, pitying smile. "It's a shame about the gambling debt in Macau. Using the payroll funds to cover a losing streak on the baccarat tables is a dangerous game, especially when the paper trail leads directly to a dummy corporation registered in your sister's name." The silence that followed was deafening. Xavier leaned back in his chair, his pulse hammering a new, erratic rhythm against his ribs. He watched, transfixed, as his fragile bride dismantled his high command with the clinical precision of a surgeon. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't even angry. She was simply stating facts as if she were reading the weather. "As for the rest of you," Varela said, her gaze sweeping the table like a searchlight, "I suggest you spend less time worrying about whether I fit the aesthetic of this house and more time wondering how much I've found in the encrypted files you thought were deleted. I am not a burden, and I am certainly not an afterthought. I am the woman who knows exactly where all of you have buried your bodies, metaphorically and otherwise. She picked up her wine glass, took a delicate sip, and looked at Xavier. The lamb is excellent, darling. Perhaps a bit too much rosemary, but otherwise perfect. The lieutenants sat frozen, their appetites vanished, their bravado replaced by a cold, creeping terror. They looked at Xavier, pleading for him to regain control, but Xavier wasn't looking at them. He was staring at Varela with a look of profound, staggering disbelief. He had expected her to need his protection at this dinner. He had prepared himself to be her shield against their mockery. Instead, she had walked into a room full of wolves and revealed that she was the one holding the leash. Xavier felt a strange, terrifying swell of pride move through him, mixed with a realization that shook him to his core. He had married her to fulfill a promise of safety, but as he looked at the shattered remains of his lieutenant's egos, he realized he wasn't the one providing the safety anymore. I believe the lady asked about the rosemary, Xavier said, his voice low and dangerous, a predatory smile finally touching his lips as he looked at Ivan. Does anyone else have something to say about my wife's presence at this table? Or should we move on to the dessert? No one spoke. The frail bride had finished her meal, and in doing so, she had reset the hierarchy of the Drakov Empire. As they rose from the table, Xavier reached out, his hand finally settling firmly on the small of her back. This time, there was no hesitation. How did you get the Macau records? He whispered as they moved toward the foyer. Varela didn't look at him, but he saw the faint, lethal glint in her eyes. I told you, Xavier. Your security is made of glass, and I've always been very good at looking through windows. The adrenaline from the dinner had not subsided. It had merely mutated into a restless, cold fire that burned in Xavier's chest. He couldn't sleep. The image of Varela, composed, lethal, and devastatingly brilliant, haunted the periphery of his vision. He found himself pacing the halls of his estate, a ghost in his own fortress, until he noticed a side door to the conservatory was unlatched. The midnight air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming nightshade. Xavier stepped into the garden, his boots silent on the stone path, expecting to find the stillness of the night. Instead, he heard it, a sharp, rhythmic hiss of air, followed by the dull thud of a strike. He followed the sound toward a secluded clearing shielded by weeping willows. There, in the pale, silver glow of the moon, was Varela. She wasn't wearing the delicate lace or the midnight silk that had defined her presence since the wedding. She was dressed in black leggings and a thin, sleeveless compression shirt that revealed the lean, corded muscle of her arms that the world thought were too fragile to carry a heavy book. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, utilitarian knot, and her face was a mask of absolute, singular focus. She was moving through a high-intensity combat drill against a heavy wooden post she had apparently dragged into the shadows. Her movements were a blur of terrifying efficiency. This wasn't the clumsy flailing of a novice. This was the refined, deadly grace of a practitioner of Krav Maga and Silat. She struck with her elbows, her knees, and the heels of her palms, each blow landing with a sickening precision that would have shattered a man's ribs. Xavier stood frozen in the shadow of a willow, his breath hitching in his throat. He had spent his life surrounded by violence, but he had never seen anything as hauntingly beautiful as Varela in motion. She wasn't just training. She was exorcising a lifetime of suppressed rage. He stepped out of the shadows, the gravel crunching beneath his boot. Varela didn't scream. She didn't flinch. In one fluid motion, she spun, her legs sweeping low in a kick that would have taken Xavier's legs out if he hadn't jumped back. Before he could regain his footing, she was in his space, her fingers curled into a strike aimed directly at his throat. He caught her wrist inches from his windpipe. The impact vibrated up his arm, the strength in her small frame staggering him. For a breathless second, they were locked together, chest to chest, their pulses hammering in a frantic, synchronized rhythm. The attic girl, Xavier rasped, his eyes searching hers in the moonlight. The slow, clumsy cousin. Was any of it real, Varela? Varela didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her skin slick with sweat, her breath hot against his neck. The physical proximity was electric, a sudden, violent tension that made the air between them feel like it was about to combust. I spent 20 years being what they needed me to be so they would stop looking at me, she whispered, her voice stripped of its polite veneer. When they think you're a victim, they talk. They leave their ledgers open. They forget to lock the doors. My frailty was the best armor I ever had. Xavier's grip on her wrist tightened, but not in a way that hurt. It was the grip of a man trying to anchor himself in a storm. He looked down at her, really looked at her, and saw the scars on her knuckles, the fire in her eyes, and the raw, untamed power she had been forced to hide. Leo knew. Xavier realized, his voice a low growl of discovery. He didn't ask me to protect you from the world. He asked me to protect the world from you. Varela let out a short, jagged laugh and finally pulled her wrist free. She stepped back, but the tension didn't dissipate. It only stretched between them like a taut wire. And which are you, Xavier? The world or my husband? The question hung in the cool night air, heavy and dangerous. Xavier looked at his hand, still tingling from the heat of her skin. He had spent his life thinking he was the predator, the one who dictated the terms of every engagement. But as he watched Varela pick up a towel and wipe the sweat from her brow with the same casual elegance she used to sip tea, he realized the truth. He wasn't her protector. He was her audience. And the play had only just begun. I think, Xavier said, his voice thick with a new, obsessive hunger, that I'm the only man who is ever going to see you for what you truly are. And I'm starting to think I'm the only one who can handle it. Varela turned, her silhouette framed by the moonlight as she began to walk back toward the house. Then try to keep up, Xavier. It would be a shame if I had to leave you behind. As she vanished into the darkness of the conservatory, Xavier remained in the garden, his heart racing with a fear he had never felt before. The fear of a man who had finally met something he couldn't control and realizing he didn't want to. Before we continue, it's important that I say this. One of the most overlooked but critical health habits, especially for older adults, is staying properly hydrated. As we age, the body's sense of thirst weakens, making it easy to become dehydrated without realizing it. Chronic mild dehydration can contribute to fatigue, dizziness, confusion, constipation, urinary tract infections, and even increased risk of falls. Adequate hydration also supports kidney function, helps regulate body temperature, and keeps joints lubricated. Don't rely on thirst alone. Make it a routine to drink water throughout the day. A simple rule is to sip water every 1 to 2 hours while awake, even if you don't feel thirsty. Include hydrating foods like fruits and vegetables, and limit excessive caffeine or alcohol, which can increase fluid loss. For many older adults, something as simple as consistent water intake can significantly improve energy, mental clarity, and overall well-being. The morning was deceptively still, the kind of quiet that precedes a controlled demolition. Xavier was in his study, reviewing the digital wreckage Varela had left of his lieutenant's pride when the front gates signaled a breach. It wasn't an army or a rival syndicate. It was a fleet of black sedans bearing the Solène crest, the family that had spent decades treating Varela like a ghost and were now here to haunt her new life. Mikhail Solène entered the grand foyer as if he still owned the woman he had sold. He looked around the Drakov marble with a greedy, squinted gaze, flanked by his sons and a lawyer whose briefcase looked heavier than his conscience. Xavier met them at the base of the stairs, his presence a wall of cold, silent granite. He expected Varela to be in the residential wing, tucked away as they had discussed, but as he opened his mouth to dismiss the intruders, he heard the steady, rhythmic click of heels on stone. Varela descended the staircase with a grace that felt predatory. She was back in her mask, soft, unassuming, her eyes downcast as if the weight of the room were too much for her. "Uncle," she murmured, her voice small and wavering. Mikhail didn't even look at her face. He looked at the diamond on her finger. "Varela, we've had a change of heart. The inheritance Leo left you, the offshore trust, was never legally his to give. We're here to collect the signature you forgot to provide before the wedding. Once you sign the transfer, we'll leave you to your husband." Xavier's hand moved toward the holster at his small of his back, his jaw tight. "She isn't signing anything. Leave, before I decide that Leo's debt doesn't cover your survival." "It's all right, Xavier," Varela said, stepping forward with a trembling hand. She looked at Mikhail with a watery, desperate smile. If it makes the family happy, I'll sign. I just want the cursed reputation to end. I've already prepared the digital authorization on my tablet. I just need your biometric confirmation to finalize the transfer of the Solen assets. Mikhail chuckled, a dry, triumphant sound. Smart girl. Finally realizing your place. He pressed his thumb to the tablet Varela held out, his sons crowding around to witness the reclamation of their wealth. Xavier watched in stunned silence, his chest tight with a sudden, sharp disappointment. Was she folding? Was the warrior he had seen in the garden just a temporary flare of defiance? The tablet chimed, a bright, cheerful sound. Varela's posture shifted instantly. The tremble in her hand vanished. She straightened her spine, her head tilting back as she looked Mikhail directly in the eye with a gaze so cold it seemed to suck the heat from the room. Thank you, uncle, she said, her voice dropping the facade and turning into a blade of pure ice. By confirming your biometrics, you didn't just authorize a transfer. You just acknowledged full personal liability for the $22 million in unaccounted losses I discovered in the Solen textile accounts this morning. Losses that, as of 10 seconds ago, were reported to the Federal Tax Authority from an anonymous, encrypted Drakov server. Mikhail's face went from smug to ashen in a heartbeat. What? You little. I didn't sign over my trust, Varela continued, stepping into his personal space, her calm center making his frantic anger look pathetic. I used your ego to bypass the two-factor authentication on the family's primary ledger. You just gifted me the controlling interest in the Solen estate to cover the debts you didn't know you had. In 3 minutes, your personal accounts will be frozen. In 6, the police will be at your front door. The lawyer's briefcase hit the floor with a dull thud. Mikhail lunged for her, his face contorted in a mask of primal rage, but he never reached her. Xavier was there first, his hand closing around Mikhail's throat with enough force to lift the man off his heels. Xavier didn't look at the man he was choking. He was looking at Varela. He saw the quiet, lethal satisfaction in her eyes, the way she didn't even blink as her family began to scramble and wail. She hadn't hidden. She hadn't needed his gun. She had used their own greed as a noose and pulled the cord. Get them out of my house, Xavier growled to his guards, his eyes never leaving his wife. As the Solenes were dragged away, screaming about betrayals and curses, the foyer returned to its oppressive, beautiful silence. Varela calmly swiped a finger across the tablet, closing the program, and looked at Xavier. I told you, Xavier, she said, her voice light, almost conversational. I needed your resources to dismantle them. I hope you don't mind that I used your server for the upload. It was much faster than the one in the attic. Xavier let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the wedding. He walked toward her, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the terrifying, brilliant woman standing before him. You didn't just dismantle them, Xavier whispered, his hand reaching out to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. You erased them. Varela leaned into his touch, a small, genuine smile finally playing on her lips. They wanted to collect on me, Xavier. I just made sure they paid the full price. The victory over the Solen family had left a lingering, electric hum in the air of the Drakov estate, a vibration of shared triumph that Xavier found himself chasing into the late hours. For the first time since the wedding, the oppressive weight of the contract felt light, replaced by a curiosity that bordered on obsession. He had retreated to the private balcony overlooking the city's jagged skyline, 2 glasses of vintage Burlo breathing on the stone table between them. Varela joined him, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of the study behind her. She had traded the armor of her lace wedding finery for a simple silk slip dress that shimmered like oil on water. As she sat, Xavier felt the familiar pull of her presence, the gravity of a woman who had spent a lifetime being a shadow and was now outshining the stars. To the reclamation of the Solen Empire, Xavier said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. He lifted his glass, his eyes locked on hers. And to the woman who did it without firing a single shot. Varela reached for her glass, her fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of heat through Xavier's veins that no wine could replicate. Not a single shot yet, Xavier, she murmured, a playful, lethal tilt to her lips. The night is still young. They raised their glasses in a silent, private toast. The wine was deep, ruby red, the color of the life they both lived. But as Xavier brought the rim to his lips, he noticed something. It wasn't a sound, but a visual glitch, a tiny, refracted red dancing on the crystal of Varea's glass. A sniper's laser. Down! Xavier roared, his instinct to protect her eclipsing every other thought. He lunged across the table, his hand reaching to sweep her out of the line of fire. But Varea was already moving. She didn't drop to the floor like a victim. She threw her body into Xavier's, her momentum forcing him back into the heavy stone alcove of the balcony, just as the first suppressed crack shattered the silence. The glass Xavier had been holding exploded in a spray of crystal and red liquid, but it wasn't just wine that painted the white marble floor. Varea let out a sharp, choked gasp, her body tensing against his. Varea! Xavier's voice was a raw, primal sound. He spun them deeper into the shadows, his back to the wall, his arms locking around her with a terrified strength. He looked down, his heart stopping in his chest. A line of crimson was spreading rapidly across the white silk of her shoulder, the fabric shredded by the high-velocity round that had been meant for his head. She had seen the dot a fraction of a second before he had. She hadn't moved to save herself. She had used her body as a shield for his. "Stay still," she whispered, her face pale, her teeth gritted against the pain. She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled a small, sleek transmitter from her thigh holster, the same device she had used to dismantle her family. Sector 4, high-rise, southeast. Counter-snipers, fire for effect. Now, outside, the night erupted. The rhythmic thump of his security team's return fire echoed across the plaza, but Xavier didn't hear it. He was focused entirely on the woman in his arms. He dropped to his knees, pulling her into his lap, his hands trembling as he pressed his palm against the wound to staunch the flow. "Why?" Xavier rasped, his eyes burning with a sudden, violent clarity. "You had the angle. You could have dropped alone. Why did you take it for me?" Varea looked up at him, her gray eyes clouded with pain but still anchored by that terrifying, calm awareness. She reached up, her blood-stained fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw, leaving a smear of red against his skin. "Because the contract isn't the only thing keeping me here, Xavier," she said, her voice fading to a fragile thread. "And because, I told you, I prefer my husband alive." As her eyes fluttered shut and her head fell back against his shoulder, the ice in Xavier's heart finally, violently shattered. He had spent his life believing that love was a liability, a system error in the grand machine of power. But as he felt Varea's blood soaking into his shirt, he realized the truth. He wasn't afraid of losing his empire or his life. He was terrified of a world where she didn't exist to challenge him. He gathered her into his arms, rising with a lethal, focused energy. "Get the medical team," he bellowed into the house, his voice shaking the very foundations of the estate. "If she dies, this whole city burns with her." He looked down at her quiet, composed face, the unwanted bride who had just bled for a man who thought he didn't need anyone. In the carnage of the balcony, amidst the broken glass and the blood-stained wine, Xavier Drakov finally faced the one thing he wasn't ready for. He wasn't just obsessed with her. He was hers. The smell of sterile antiseptic and industrial cleaner clung to the recovery wing of the Drakov estate, but the atmosphere was soon choked by the heavy, metallic scent of a coming storm. Xavier stood by Varea's bedside, his eyes fixed on the bandage covering her shoulder. She was awake, her face pale but her gaze as sharp as a razor, watching the flickering blue light of the television mounted on the wall. The news was a bloodbath of his reputation. Federal agents were swarming the Drakov shipping docks, flashing warrants that alleged a massive, untraceable conspiracy involving international arms smuggling. Evidence so perfectly planted, so intricately woven into his personal digital signature, that even Xavier couldn't see the seams. For the first time in his life, the granite boss felt the foundation crumbling. This wasn't a street war he could win with bullets. This was a legal execution. A heavy knock echoed at the door. Marcus, the lieutenant Varea had spared at dinner, stepped in, his face gray with defeat. "Boss, the feds are at the gate. They have a signed indictment." They're claiming they found a hidden ledger in your private study that links you to the Petrov massacre 3 years ago. It's a setup, but it's flawless. We can't fight this. If you resist, they'll level this house with her inside it. Xavian looked at Varela, then back at the door. He felt a cold, hollow resignation settle in his marrow. He was a predator, but he was also a pragmatist. He could survive a prison cell, but he couldn't survive watching his estate become a war zone while she was still healing from a bullet meant for him. I'm going out, Xavian said, his voice a dead, flat rasp. I'll surrender. Keep the security team stood down. If I'm the only one they take, they leave the house alone. Sit down, Xavian. The voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a gavel. Xavian turned to see Varela sitting up, ignoring the wince of pain that crossed her features. She reached for the laptop sitting on her rolling bedside table, her fingers flying across the keys with a familiar, lethal rhythm. You're not surrendering, she said, her eyes reflected in the glow of the screen. And you're certainly not letting them through those gates. That hidden ledger they think they found? I wrote it. 6 months ago. Xavian froze, his hand halfway to his holster. What are you talking about? Varela didn't look up. You've wondered how you survived the last 4 federal investigations, haven't you? How the evidence always seemed to vanish, or how the key witnesses suddenly suffered from convenient amnesia. You thought you were lucky. You thought your ghost lawyer was just the best in the business. She turned the screen toward him. It wasn't a hacking interface this time. It was a secure legal portal, showing a series of encrypted filings under a pseudonym that Xavian recognized instantly. The legal phantom that had saved his empire from 3 separate RICO indictments over the last 5 years. The ghost isn't a firm in Zurich, Xavian, Varela said, her voice steady and devoid of pride. It's me. I've been your fixer since Leo first told me what you were doing. I wasn't just fixing your mistakes from an attic. I was building a digital failsafe for this exact moment. The ledger they found is a Trojan horse. Within 10 minutes of them opening it at the Federal Bureau, it will begin an automated scrub of every server in their building, replacing your name with the names of the Solène board members who actually authorized those shipments. Xavian stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. He looked at the woman who had been his burden, the unwanted cousin he was supposed to protect, and realized he was looking at the architect of his entire survival. You've been protecting me. For years, he whispered, the power reversal hitting him with the force of a physical blow. I was protecting my investment, she countered, though the softness in her eyes betrayed her. Leo knew I was the only person smart enough to keep you out of a cage. And I knew you were the only man dangerous enough to keep me out of one. She hit the enter key with a final, decisive click. On the security monitors, the federal vehicles at the gate suddenly began to reverse. Their communications had been compromised. The orders were being retracted in real time as the evidence they held turned into a liability for their own department. Varela leaned back against her pillows, the effort clearly draining her, but her gaze remained locked on Xavian's. He walked over to her, sinking onto the edge of the bed. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was the one who had been unaware. You're not a ghost, Xavian said, taking her hand and pressing it against his heart, which was finally beating with something other than cold calculation. You're the engine. Varela squeezed his hand, a tired but triumphant smile touching her lips. Then I suggest you stop trying to surrender, husband. We have a family legacy to finish burning. The night was a void, cold and absolute, as the Drakov motorcade pulled up to the Solène ancestral estate for the final time. The once grand gates hung slightly ajar, stripped of their prestige by the federal freezing of their assets. A digital garrote Varela had tightened from her hospital bed. Xavian stepped out of the lead car, his hand instinctively reaching back to steady Varela. She was pale, her shoulders still bound in bandages beneath a sharp, charcoal gray coat, but her eyes held a terrifying, incandescent clarity. Inside, the Solène foyer was a graveyard of broken pride. Mikhail Solène sat on a velvet settee, his sons pacing like trapped animals. The mahogany tables were littered with half-packed bags and legal notices. When Xavian and Varela entered, the air didn't just thicken, it curdled. You. Mikhail spat, his voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and hatred. He looked at Varela, his unwanted niece, as if seeing a demon for the first time. You've destroyed us. For a blood debt? For Leo? He was a fool, and you're a traitor to your own name. Varela didn't flinch. She walked into the center of the room, her presence so commanding that Xavier found himself drifting to the periphery, playing the role of the silent executioner while she took the lead. I didn't destroy you, uncle, Varela said, her voice dropping into that melodic, chilling register that Xavier had grown to crave. I simply audited you. I weighed your worth against the life you stole from me and the life Leo gave for Xavier. You were found lacking. Mikhail lunged forward, but Xavier's hand was on his weapon before the man could even clear the sofa. The Mafia boss didn't need to speak. The predatory gleam in his eyes told Mikhail that the only thing keeping him alive was Varela's permission. Varela pulled a single, heavy brass key and a slim titanium drive from her pocket. She placed them on the table with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. The federal investigation is over, she stated. I've redirected the evidence. The Solin name is finished, but the assets, the shipping lanes, the textile mills, the real estate, have all been absorbed into a shell corporation I've spent years perfecting. It was never about the money, Mikhail. It was about the power you used to make me feel small. Now, that power belongs to the man you thought was your pawn. She turned away from her family, not even granting them the dignity of a final look. She walked toward Xavier, picking up the key and the drive. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Mikhail's ragged, defeated breathing. Once they were back in the car, the heated interior of the Maybach felt like a sanctuary. The city lights blurred into long, golden streaks as they drove away from the wreckage of her past. Varela leaned her head back against the leather, the exhaustion finally visible in the faint tremble of her fingers. She reached out and took Xavier's hand, pressing the brass key and the titanium drive into his palm. The keys to the kingdom, Xavier, she whispered. Every dock, every warehouse, every cent they ever hid. It's all yours. The Drakov Empire just doubled in size overnight. Xavier looked at the small objects in his hand, then at the woman beside him. He felt a swell of something so much deeper than greed or triumph. He didn't care about the warehouses or the shipping lanes. He cared about the woman who had conquered a dynasty and then handed him the spoils of war as if they were nothing more than a trinket. I don't want their keys, Varela, Xavier said, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion. He closed his fingers over hers, trapping the key between their palms. I told you before, you're the engine. I don't want their empire. I want the woman who took it. Varela looked at him, her gray eyes softening, the ghost finally allowing herself to be seen. You have her, Xavier. You've had her since the day you stood at that altar and didn't look at me with pity. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the tension of the last weeks finally snapping into a profound, quiet peace. They weren't just a boss and his bride anymore. They were the architects of a new world. Then let's go home, Xavier murmured. We have a new empire to run. As the car sped toward the Drakov estate, Varela closed her eyes, finally letting go of the unwanted girl from the attic. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was the light by which Xavier saw his future. The anniversary of their wedding arrived not with the roar of a celebration, but with the heavy, expectant silence of a deadline. The 1-year mark, the exact date etched into the legal contract that had once been the only thing binding them together, lay on the mahogany desk in Xavier's study. The paper looked yellowed and ancient, a relic of a time when Xavier had viewed Varela as a nuisance tax, and she had viewed him as a tactical necessity. Xavier sat behind the desk, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the document. The city lights of Moscow glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the empire he had doubled in size felt quiet tonight. He heard the door click open and knew the rhythm of her step without looking up. Varela entered, dressed in a simple, elegant gown of charcoal silk. She didn't look like the unwanted cousin anymore. She looked like a woman who had dismantled dynasties and rebuilt them in her own image. She stopped at the edge of the desk, her eyes falling on the contract. It's midnight, Xavier, she said softly. The year is up. My debt to Leo is paid, and your promise to him is fulfilled. By the terms of this paper, I am free to take my share of the Solin assets and leave. You can go back to your granite silence, and I can go back to being a ghost. Xavier stood up slowly, his presence filling the room. He walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her. The tension between them was no longer the sharp, jagged friction of two strangers. It was the deep, resonant pull of two halves of a single machine. He looked at her, at the faint scar on her shoulder from the sniper's bullet, at the steady, brilliant light in her eyes, and realized that the man who had signed that contract a year ago no longer existed. "You were never a ghost, Varaya," Xavier said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "You were the only person in this world who actually saw me. And you're right. The contract is over." He reached down, his fingers brushing hers as he picked up the document. Without a second of hesitation, he gripped the edges and tore it down the center. He tore it again and again, until the legal foundation of their marriage was nothing more than white confetti on the dark carpet. Varaya watched the pieces fall, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing, Xavier? Without that paper, there are no rules, no boundaries, no protection. I don't want to protect you anymore, Varaya," Xavier whispered, stepping into her space, his hand coming up to cup the back of her neck. His thumb traced the line of her jaw with a possessiveness that was no longer about dominance, but about devotion. "I want to rule with you. I spent my life thinking I was the boss, the alpha, the one in control. But you showed me that a king is just a target if he doesn't have a queen who is smarter than the enemies at the gate." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "The contract was a cage for both of us. I don't want a bride who is here because of a dead man's ransom. I want the ghost. I want the strategist. I want the woman who hacked my heart before I even knew it had a back door." Varaya's breath hitched, the calm center of her storm finally wavering. She reached up, her fingers locking into the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. "And if I don't want to be a partner, Xavier? If I want to be the one holding the leash?" A dark, genuine smile touched Xavier's lips, the smile of a man who had finally met his match and found peace in his surrender. "Then I'll be the first to follow your lead. I'm not the boss of this house anymore, Varaya. We are the Empire." Varaya looked at the shredded paper on the floor, then back at the man who had looked past her frailty to find her fire. She leaned up, her lips brushing against his in a seal that was more binding than any legal ink. "The Queen's gambit is finished, Xavier," she murmured against his mouth. "From now on, we play together." As they stood together in the heart of the Drakov estate, the unwanted bride and the frozen boss were gone. In their place stood a partnership forged in blood, intellect, and an unexpected, unbreakable love. The world had underestimated Varaya Solen once, and it had cost them everything. Now, the world was about to find out what happened when the most dangerous man in the city finally gave his heart to the only woman who knew how to use it. The rain still falls on Moscow, but it no longer sounds like 1,000 tiny fists against the window. Now, it sounds like a rhythmic applause for the most feared and respected partnership in the underground. 1 year after the contract was shredded, the Drakov-Solen name has become a new kind of legend. Xavier Drakov still moves with the shadow of a predator, but he no longer carries the weight of a man alone. Beside him, Varaya doesn't just walk, she leads. The unwanted cousin is now the architect of a modernized empire, having replaced the old, bloody traditions with a clinical, high-tech efficiency that has left their rivals paralyzed. They are seen at the opera, in the boardrooms, and in the quiet corners of the city. He is the iron, and she is the edge. In the halls of power, it is whispered that while Xavier may hold the gun, it is Varaya who has already decided where the bullet will land. As the sun sets over the estate, Xavier watches his wife from the doorway of the library. She is surrounded by the very books she once used as a shield, but now they are blueprints for their future. He realizes that the greatest risk he ever took wasn't the marriage or the war. It was the moment he allowed himself to be seen by the woman the rest of the world chose to ignore. In a world that thrives on noise and dominance, we often overlook the quietest person in the room. We assume that because someone takes up less space, they have less power. But as Xavier Drakov learned, the greatest threat and the greatest love isn't the one that screams for your attention. It's the one that's been watching, waiting, and outsmarting you the entire time. Never underestimate the person the world calls unwanted. They might just be the one holding the keys to your empire. Thanks for watching, and remember, the best moves are always the ones they never see coming. See you in our next story.